At the outset of his career, he was a prominent social, artistic, and political revolutionary, and, paradoxically, manifested the qualities of a mystic. The elements of paradox, of contradiction, and of inconsistency are among the things that first attracted me to Pär Lagerkvist. A social revolutionary who is a mystic of the most private and withdrawn kind, a playwright who gives his actors meaningless sounds instead of dialogue, who juxtaposes objects which are not meaningful as narrative or symbol on the stage, yet who writes compact verse of dazzling classical purity. A man who has described himself as a believer without a faith, who shouts defiance at a hard-hearted God in whom he declares he does not believe. But this inconsistency, these contradictions are in us all, and too often our face-saving critical faculties bid us plane away the evident contradictions in ourselves and in our work. All this is not to apologize for Pär Lagerkvist, to anyone coming new to his work, although at first glance he is as bewildering as any major literary figure. His work is slow in coming to international notice, firstly since he writes in a language that so few people read, secondly since the poetry that forms a substantial part of his output is difficult to translate without injury, and thirdly because the whole range of work, including autobiography, novels, plays large and small, poems and polemical writings, makes use of such widely varied means of communication that only an enormous amount of reading will convey fully the stature of the whole writer. His long essay, Modern Theatre, Viewpoint and Attack, written in 1918, deserves study for its wise, open-ended attitude to stagecraft and for its iconoclastic approach to the so-called theatrical realism. The Executioner, written both as a play and as a novel, is a barbaric, anti-naturalist piece that successfully blends different historical and social settings without any narrative support. It is extraordinary that it appeared in Sweden in 1934, for it is a blistering denunciation, by implication, of the rise of Hitler and fascism, spoken in parable. A long short story, The Masquerade of Souls, is as delicate and profound a tragic love story as modern literature has seen, and the writing is skillful and artless. The cycle of poems, entitled I stedet för tro, Instead of Faith, or In Place of Belief, appeared in 1919. Two of the poems, despite certain sour twists in the generally sweet lyricism, have become schoolroom classics in Scandinavia. Possibly the very sourness, the self-crucifying despair that the world considers to be very Swedish, evokes as deep a response in the Scandinavian reader as the haunting lyrical sweetness. Technically, Pär Lagerkvist has much in common with Robert Frost. Emotionally, he is not too far from the early, inconsolable Eliot, while the choice and use of imagery suggest at times Auden. These are guideposts only to suggest the working area of a poet who is relatively unfamiliar to the English-speaking world. He is in essence as unique as Frost, Eliot, and Auden. I set the poems of In Place of Belief in Swedish and made a singing translation in which, to preserve the exact rhythms and meaning, it was necessary for me to forego Pär Lagerkvist's rhyming schemes. In Place of Belief is the second of Pär Lagerkvist's 9 large poetic cycles, all of which are deeply personal and subjective. It has been assumed from internal evidence that he was suffering a deep personal loss at the time of writing. For these 10 poems have an anguished obsession with the unsatisfactory nature of a temporal world, a vision of an afterlife, or rather of a now-life, in a world more actual than his own, a spiritual existence signposted with the loveliest things of earth, and a defiant railing against a harsh, remote God. It would require more words than are in the poem to give a précis of them. The theme evoked in the beginning of each poem is not simply amplified as the poem proceeds. Sharp, jagged, dissonant ideas are injected where least predictable. The element of paradox is never long absent, as for example in the 4th poem describing a countryside at twilight, which begins, Day is loveliest at its ending. We find further on, all is near us, all is far away, all is given to mankind on loan. The 8th poem, which is addressed to a child that is no longer alive, begins, my child, I am coming to you. You are my father and mother. then later, you will be my father and mother. And finally, you lead me away to a far distant land, back to my father and mother. The 10th poem, addressed again directly to the dead child, I shall die and you will live, ends with splendid and moving defiance of mortality. By the grave will you live smiling, where what is not you is concealed. Pär Lagerkvist wishes life for the child, but for himself oblivion. He listens to a lonely flute that sings from the high and desolate bridge between life and death. My cycle, In Place of Belief, was commissioned by the Kindler Foundation in Washington, D.C., USA, and was first performed at the National Textile Museum in that city under the auspices of the Kindler Foundation in January 1971. The work is dedicated to the American husband and wife piano duo team Arthur and Alice Nagel. It is scored for 6-part chorus and piano 4 hands. The first of the poems, I nestle secure against heaven's breast, leads without a break into the violent rise up on wings that are bleeding. The third, The sun now loosens her pale blonde hair, is a pastoral for female voices and piano. The fourth, Day is loveliest at its ending, is a pastoral commemorating the dying of a day. I know that yonder where I see but darkly, the fifth song, is set for male voices in unison and piano. How Savours the Earth of Eternity is the sixth. The seventh, Who Plays in the Night Time of You and Me. The eighth is a tenor solo accompanied by female voices. My child, I come to your side. The ninth poem is set unaccompanied for the full chorus, Come with a dream to your father's side. And the final 10th poem, I shall die and you will live yet, is set for the complete vocal and pianistic forces. In this performance, the BBC chorus, with Richard Rodney Bennett and myself playing the piano duet, are under the direction of Peter Gellhorn.